weeks, the Empire Files team traveled the West Bank and Palestine. What we saw was one of the biggest human rights disasters on the planet. A brutal and growing military occupation that thrives off U.S. sponsorship, soon to be strengthened even more by another $38 billion in U.S. tax dollars, the largest military aid deal in history. This stark reality is never taught to us in school, and whenever we do hear about Palestine in the media, it might as well be directly from the Pentagon. It's a place the majority of Americans only get a first-hand look at on so-called birthright tours, which sell Israel as a fun, peace-loving country, living under threat of genocide from Muslims. The side we saw was very, very different. But the truth is actually much clearer. And before we show you what we saw on the ground, we must go back to understand the real history of how things got to where they are today. Many people have seen this famous map, showing the ever-shrinking borders of Palestine. But likely far less people could explain why the borders have changed so dramatically. Each phase and the stories behind them are essential pieces to a puzzle that we're told is just too complicated. First, how did these original borders of Palestine form, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea? The countries of the modern Middle East were once the same swath of territory owned by the Ottoman Empire. Of the nearly 500,000 people living in Ottoman Palestine, 75% were Muslim, 20% Christian, and 5% Jewish. Nearly 100% were Arab. Its cities, especially Jerusalem, were buzzing hives of Arab art and culture, a destination for intellectuals across the Middle East. Before Palestine had borders, it was a recognizable nation, its cultural identities distinct, with deep roots in the land. But plans for that land were being made elsewhere in the world. In the late 1800s, it was being eyed to be colonized. In the United States, Europe, and Russia, anti-Semitism was a dangerous and growing force. Mob killings of Jewish people were a regular occurrence. In this climate of terror began what is known as Zionism, or the belief in an exclusively Jewish state to be established somewhere in the world. From its founding through the first half of the 20th century, the Zionists remained an extremely small minority among Jewish people. The ideology was rejected by both religious and secular Jewish people, who agreed that anti-Semitism was a great danger, but that they should organize to defeat it in their home countries, rather than by mass exodus to another people's land. Many argue that exporting entire Jewish populations from Europe was in essence acquiescing to the demands of anti-Semites. But Zionism, however marginalized, became a fervent political movement, led by its proclaimed father, Theodor Herzl, an Austrian atheist. While first considering Argentina and Uganda as a homeland, the Zionist movement claimed rights to what it called Greater Israel, which includes all of Palestine and part of today's Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt. Their right to this land was based on the ancient biblical kingdoms of the Old Testament, which disappeared 600 years before the birth of Jesus. Herzl's job became jet-setting around the world, lobbying those in power he thought would be sympathetic to his project. The Zionists, more than anything, needed money to fund settlements, and ultimately a decree from the world's colonial powers. Herzl wrote to the Grand Duke of Baden, "If it is God's will that we return to our historic fatherland, we should like to do so as representatives of Western civilization and bring cleanliness, order, and well-established customs to this plague-ridden, blighted corner of the Orient." The early Zionists promised to make Palestine a vanguard against barbarism, aka an extension of Western military power, and build highways of the civilized peoples, aka trade for European millionaires. The center of the campaign for the creation of Israel was the slogan, "A land without a people, for a people without a land." The assertion that there were no people in Palestine prior to Zionist settlements became the keystone of their policies. But they were always very well aware of the people there. In the words of another leading Zionist, Israel Zangwill, Palestine is not so much occupied by the Arabs as overrun by them. From its inception, political Zionism was not only a plan for colonization and expansion, but one of expulsion of the land's indigenous inhabitants. Much of historic Palestine was semi-feudal, with farmers living and working on land owned by wealthy individuals who lived far away in fancy cities of Syria and Jordan. Zionist settlers began purchasing this land in 1882. Many evicted its indigenous people to build the first settlements. Despite Jews, Muslims, and Christians living in relative harmony for thousands of years, this sprouted immediate tension and conflict. With the Zionist project getting a slow start, a new opportunity presented itself with the outbreak of World War I. Herzl and his partners knew the victors would be slicing up the colonies of the losers. which included Palestine. Aristocrats from Great Britain, France, and Russia were secretly carving up the Middle East amongst themselves. The infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement drew new borders, creating Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the first formal borders of Palestine. It was put under British colonial control. Riots in Jerusalem protested the takeover by yet another empire. With Ottoman Palestine becoming British Mandate Palestine, the Zionist movement had won a major step. With the flick of a wrist, a small group of British lords issued the Balfour Declaration, pledging to help achieve this objective. The British made it much easier for well-funded settlement projects to take more Palestinian land, dispossessing even more people. Yet Zionists' aim for a homeland in all of Greater Israel, without the indigenous Arabs, was still driving them. In 1919, a U.S. envoy reported, the Zionists looked forward to a practically complete dispossession of the present non-Jewish inhabitants of Palestine. Settlers had now become 10% of the population, growing with large donations from Western tycoons. The settlements had already created a refugee crisis. This photo from 1929 depicts a rally in Syria of Palestinian refugees, of which there were 50,000. With this new backing, the colonial project picked up its pace, purchasing even larger chunks of earth from the feudal landlords and creating small pockets of territory. Leader in the settlement movement, Ben-Gurion, who would become Israel's first prime minister and mascot for Tel Aviv's airport, wrote about the early days. We were not just working. We were conquering land. We were a company of conquistadors. From 1920 to 1939, the settler population rose from 10 to 30%, and there was no confusion about what they were there to do. As Gurion himself said, we must expel the Arabs and take their places. Throughout these years, Palestinians launched several attacks on the encroaching settlements. Big clashes between settlers and Palestinians in cities grew deadly, killing many on both sides. But an era of wildly disproportionate death was about to begin. In 1936, the Palestinians launched a mass general strike. Protests lit up in numerous cities, and the strike held strong for 6 months. While initially peaceful, the British occupiers responded by declaring martial law. They recruited Zionist fighters to join them in raiding and attacking Palestinian villages. Scores of dissidents were executed. The strike evolved into an armed uprising against British rule. The British, along with their Zionist partners, used a strategy of blowing up thousands of Palestinian homes. On a single day in the village of Jaffa, they demolished over 200. This uprising was drowned in blood by the sheer force of the British imperial machine by 1939. 5,000 Palestinians were left dead. On the other side, 300 settlers and 250 British soldiers. It was through this bloody repression that the Zionists formed a bona fide armed forces, with thousands of them who were trained and armed by the British Army. In reality, it consisted of 2 wings. The Haganah, the official military force recognized by British authorities, and the other, a more radical wing, the Zionist militias. The biggest, the Irgun, with membership in the thousands. The Irgun was a more hardline terrorist organization that mostly targeted Palestinians, bombing civilian markets and more. Years later, they would also start attacking British soldiers. Their most famous attack was the bombing of the King David Hotel, murdering 91 people, among them 17 Jews. This ruthless approach of the Irgun was so popular in the settler consciousness that one of its head commanders, who presided over many massacres, would later become Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin. Albert Einstein and dozens of other Jewish academics and icons published a letter in the New York Times describing Begin's movement as a political party closely akin in its organization, methods, political philosophy, and social appeal to the Nazi and fascist parties. As both the Haganah and the Irgun advanced colonization, their goal remained clear. President of the Jewish National Fund, a group designated to reclaim the land of Israel, Joseph Weitz, wrote in 1940, "There is no room for both people in this country, and there is no way besides transferring the Arabs from here to neighboring countries to transfer them all. We must not leave a single village, a single tribe."